And so the issue is, especially in this day of mass media, the reason I would not be in favor of continuing the initiative is because it's too easy to play on the emotions of people, to sway them. It does not lend itself, our mass media does not lend itself to a discussion and debate. I mean, even if you look at the debates right now that we call presidential debates, they're not debates. Okay? They bear no resemblance to, for example, the Lincoln-Douglas debates. They're more question and answers where, you know, those questions and answers get determined by the questioners, not by so much the two candidates or five candidates or whatever. They're not, the candidates in many respects are not allowed to interact with each other.
No.
Right? So they're not even really debates. And so I would argue that we're at much more risk under a full democracy and under the initiative than we are if we have a republic. Yeah.
You have the next slide that's from the anti-federalists.
The anti-federalists were not in favor of a democracy.
Right.
Okay? The thing to remember is, you got to remember the anti-federalists were slow on the drop. In other words, they let the Federalists claim the Federalist title. Okay? And so the anti-federalists were really Federalists. They were really Republicans, right? In the sense that they did not want mob rule. And of course, what was going on at the same time that this is being discussed in France, right? There you have a democracy. And you have the Reign of Terror and so on.
But
Yeah?
the whole Jeffersonian idea...
Oh, Jefferson was not in favor of the mob. Jefferson feared the mob greatly.
Absolutely, but what we're having is where if you can win a presidential candidacy in several large states, or you can load it in the primaries, you can have, it's almost as if the other side can dictate the candidate you will end up with, as we saw with the weaker McCain being the one who actually became the candidate. Does that make sense?
Well, kind of.
Okay.
But that's always going to be the case. And I would argue that the current setup, and this is one of the reasons why the founders set up the Electoral College. The president is not elected by the mass of people. And the Electoral College is set up on purpose to maintain this Republican form of government as opposed to a Democratic form of government. Okay? Because you have to remember, when the Electoral College was set up, you have to understand how it worked, because it didn't work back then like it works today. And the reason it didn't work back then the way it works today is because the delegates from each of the electors were meant to represent their electoral district. Okay? And what that meant was, and what they were concerned about was the whole big state versus small state issue, and even more than that, the big city versus rural issue. Okay? And the way that manifests itself today is that a candidate can basically campaign in the big cities. They will tend to favor the issues that concern big cities, and the reason is because, especially in a state like Oregon, if you win massively in Portland, the rest of the state doesn't matter. Because we have a winner-take-all in terms of the electoral votes. So it used to be the electoral votes were split. You know, it wasn't a winner-take-all system. And one of the reasons for that was to make sure that where there was population density, the candidates had to be concerned with everybody's concerns, not just with the concerns about where there was a greater mass of people, whether it was in a large state or in a large city. And we've lost that perspective today, and in fact, we have people, you know, you ever wonder why the socialists are in fact so in favor of democracy? It's because they know that through the mass media, they can move public opinion in a way that touches emotion, not their head. Okay?
Well, but to take the counterpoint to that, by looking at the homosexual agenda, anytime there's a vote, their side loses. So what they do is challenge every time, well, you take Proposition 8 in California, for example. That's the third time the state of California has voted on marriage being one man, one woman, and it's been upheld every single time, and it's been litigated every single time by the opponents. So what Doug says is true in terms of trying to manipulate the masses, but in terms of how you actually get it enacted into law, the prevailing mentality nowadays is you do not try and get the people to vote for it or even the legislature to vote for it. You get somebody in a black robe to vote for it.
Right. Yeah.
I guess what I'm trying to condense down is it seems like the more that politicians are removed from the people, the less accountable they are. How do we keep the accountability that is being lost as the system morphs? And it feels like, you know, for instance, the senators wanting to put illegal immigration through a couple times ago, the senators pulling the stunt with the health care bill, actually the House pulling the stunt. You know, we see stuff that is where the legislators are not even listening anymore.
Right. Right. Mm-hmm. And that's because, quite frankly, we keep returning them to office. I mean, you know, I think the last election got some people's attention. Unfortunately, it got the wrong people's attention from what I've seen recently.
Yeah.
Right? The Republicans aren't listening.
Leadership.
And the Democrats are,
Yeah.
quite frankly. Right? I don't like the way they're listening, but they are listening.
Yeah.
Same thing in Wisconsin. Yeah.
Well, as Herb pointed out, you know, the agitators, the socialists, whatever, they don't really believe in democracy, or they would say, okay then, after these elections, and they don't. They actually find it easier to control the few guys at the top, like a president or Congress or whatever. But it's important to keep drilling into everybody's heads that the individual is the ethical authority for law. You know, you decide what's right and wrong for yourself, and the idea that majority vote is the ethical authority is compatible with that, more than people need to vote for a guy because he understands God's law and will implement it, whatever people want.
Yeah.
Well, and what I was going to say, and I think Madison really captures it here, if the people aren't paying attention, bad stuff happens.
Right.
And if you look at the 9th and 10th Amendment, I mean, most people don't pay any attention to the 9th and 10th Amendment, but they're really critical to this whole thing in terms of understanding how our government works. And if the people are not engaged, the government falls apart.
Right.
And we can say what we want about, I mean, Robert alluded to, the public officials don't listen today. Well, let's go back 200 years. What do you suppose the chances are that people were listening to a farmer in western Massachusetts? You know, you could make the same argument there. To my understanding, things haven't really changed all that much, but it's just a question of whether government officials perceive that they're amenable to the people or not. And we have to factor in the 9th and 10th Amendment as I see it, so that people understand that ultimately it's all up to us.
Well, I think the other thing too is that we've lost in the culture the idea that the federal government is not the supreme, ultimate, final authority.